Bible's not just a book. It's not an incredible read. It is a book of life. It is truth that never changes. The same yesterday, today, tomorrow. It's an incredible book written by over 40 authors over a period of 1,600 years, 3 different languages on multiple continents at different times, and yet it all is written through the expression and the personality and the style of the writers, but it is the very God-breathed word. They wrote exactly as God led them to read. The Old Testament and the New Testament are God's revelation to us. They're His love letter to us. They're not to be read as something that we got to get through and we got to learn, and it's homework or it's schoolwork or it's like coming home and just continuing your job and ongoing education. It is to learn about God, and it's the way of life. Now, the two the two words that I want you to associate with testament, because it makes them come more alive. The testament can also mean a covenant, or it can mean an agreement. And so there was an Old Testament, Old Covenant, Old Agreement. There's a New Testament, New Covenant, New Agreement. The agreement in the Old Testament is that God would have a relationship with us before sending a Savior to take care of our sin. It was temporary. And He said, the way we'll do this is through the law. I'm going to give you the law, and if you have faith in me, you'll seek to follow the law. To please me, knowing I'm righteous, you'll worship me. And if you fail the law, you will go through a system of sacrifices and repentances in order to be restored to righteousness through the shedding of blood. The New Testament, the New Covenant, the New Agreement is God's agreement with relationship after Christ, and it's by grace. And so sometimes maybe you're tempted to think, I wish I could have lived back there and seen those miracles. No, you don't want to live back there. We live by grace and the full revelation of God that we have. The way you remember the number of books in the Bible is Old has 3 letters, Testament has 9. So there's 39 Old Testament books. Well, how many New Testament? 3 times 9 is 27. So you have 39 Old Testament books, 27 new, for a total of 66. The Old Testament is broken down, and it's a beautiful thing. It is broken down into 17 historical books. The first 5 of those, just remember 17, and it's 5 and 12. The first 5 are the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then there's 12 more historical books. Now, when you get into the middle section, the Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, there are 5 of those, and those are poetry. And so, for instance, you might read Job, but historically it's placed back in the time of Genesis. Many people think that may have taken place around the time of Abraham, is when Job lived. And so it's not historical at that point, so you may be reading something then that was written back at a different historical period. Those first 17 books, once you get to the end of those, everything that happened in that Old Testament is done. The poetry books are moving from the events to the personal relationship with God. And then the last 17 books are the prophetical books. They're the prophecy is what to come with a Messiah, a new age, and a new eventual kingdom. And there's 5 major prophets who wrote far more material and 12 minor prophets. So it's 17 broken down into 5 and 12, and then there's 5, and then there's 17 broken down to 5 and 12. That takes us to Genesis. Chapters 1 through 11 give us the answers that lost people grumble against God over and over about. If God's so good, why do people murder each other, even innocent people? If God's so good, why is there evil? If God is so good, why are there multiple nations? It seems like He favors somebody. If God's so good, why are His people so hated by so many people? Well, Genesis 1 through 11 tells us all those things. It gives you the foundation of the beginnings of everything, and it's a number of events. So let's try to say it. I gave you first letters. And it's time for you to start memorizing. I've given you little tips. I think with just a little work, you will be able to tell the whole Old Testament by the time we're through. Okay, so let's do it. Dear people, Genesis 1 through 11. Chapter 1 and 2 cover creation. Chapter 3, it doesn't take long, there is a fall. And when there's a fall, ultimately it's going to result in chapter 4, a first murder. Chapter 5 is genealogy. Not so important to us, but exceptionally important to trace the history of the coming Messiah and who could prove genealogically that they're the Messiah. Chapter 6 through 9 is, it's the flood. Shows how the propensity of God's creation, the tendency of mankind is to grow evil. No matter what he does, no matter what system he has us on, relating to us, whether it's him relating person like Adam and Eve, or whether it's through patriarchs, or whether it's through judges or through kings, it is the picture of mankind's tendency to go down. Chapter 9 actually introduces Abraham of that in the midst of it. It's talking about the flood, and then Abraham sets apart as a righteous man. Chapter 10 is more genealogy, and then chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. Okay, you can see that. We can put that up now. Let's go through it again. 1 and 2 is creation. 3 is the fall. 4 is murder. 5 is genealogy. 6 through 9, the flood. 10, genealogy. And chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. You had the major events and the major questions answered. Now, if you will accept what the Bible teaches God did on creation, and what he did with the fall, and who he chose, and those kind of things, you can accept anything. That's the reason there's so much battle over whether those things are true or they don't really mean that or whatever. And so first man, first family, first sin, first murder, all those things found in there. And now we're going to move to Genesis chapter 12, the Abrahamic covenant, because God is going to choose a man who is going to found a nation who are going to be his light, and they're going to be his priest, and they're meant to take him out to the world and show what it's like to have a relationship with God. So Genesis chapter 12 shifts. 1 through 11 are those events. Chapter 12 shifts to 4 people. The 4 major people are the 3 patriarchs of Israel: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph is going to have the 12 brothers who are the tribes, and you're going to go from there. But in the Abrahamic promise, that's a little different. What was the Abrahamic promise? It was land, it was seed, it was blessing. I want you to memorize that. He says, I will give you these boundaries, will be the land I've given to you. Has he ever fulfilled that? No. Is he going to fulfill it through the church? No. He's going to fulfill it through Israel. He promised it to Israel. It was an unconditional covenant to Abraham. And when's it going to take place? In the millennial kingdom. He will give those boundaries to Israel. And then he said seed. He said, from your little itty bitty family, I'm going to grow a family that is more numerous than the stars of the sky and the sea of the sandshore. And through your seed is going to come the very Son of God. And through your seed is going to come the Messiah. And then the blessing is, he says, I'll bless you. And sometimes I'm going to send curse on you if you don't obey me. But those who honor you, I'll bless. And the other nations who curse you, I'll curse. And so it starts down at Ur of Chaldees. Abraham was a Chaldean. They worshiped false gods, but he had faith in the true living God. It's down by the top of the Persian Gulf is where Ur was. He is going to be the salt of the earth. He's going to become salt of the earth, and that's a synonym for 4 people who are going to leave to head to the promised land. Sarah, who's Abraham's wife, Abraham, Lot, and Terah. So you're going to have Sarah, Abraham, Lot, his nephew, and Terah, who is his father, who's going to die up in Haran and not go down into the promised land. They're going to leave Ur, which in this room, I'll show you in a minute how we're going to put geology in this room. Ur's going to be back there in that back corner in that section. He's going to come up through the Tigris and the Euphrates River and land somewhere up in Haran. And my family and this blessed group here is Canaan. Okay? So we'll talk about that in just a minute, and we'll go through that. Now, when they got in Haran, Terah dies. Terah and Lot weren't called to come. They just came with Abraham. It was to be he and his wife, and that's okay. But the call wasn't to them. It was to Abraham and Sarah and his line. In Joshua 24:2, it tells us that Terah worshiped multiple gods. And in Genesis 11:31, it told us that for a while, Abraham dwelt in Haran. And while he was there, he went from a man who had very little to very, very prosperous. And in Genesis 12, God reaffirms that covenant, the Abrahamic covenant he had started and mentioned initially in Genesis chapter 9. Now, he's going to come. That leads us to today in our new section. He's going to come south into the promised land. The land also called Canaan. Canaan was filled with whom? Canaanites. And so that's the problem. I'm going to give you this promised land, but you've got to drive them out. Now, back here in this corner, I'm flashing. I'll try not to flash anybody's eyes. That's going to be the Persian Gulf, and at the top of the Persian Gulf is going to be somewhere without flash. Sorry, got you. Right in here, you mean Babylonians right there. See them? Boo them. Boo. Bad Babylonians. Bad Assyrians right about here. Boo. Going to go up through the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, land somewhere here in Haran. He's going to get wealthy. Terah's going to die. He's going to come from Haran. He's going to go back south down here. And somewhere right about here is the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum, some of the miracles, a lot of Jesus' ministry was in this area around the Sea of Galilee. It empties into the Jordan River, which is a winding river, which is right here. And man, Ben, you smell. Dead Sea right there. Look at him. Stand up. Show us the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea. Okay? Thanks for being a good sport. That was Charles Crotcha in the early service. And so here, if you've got Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, and the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on the planet, water comes into it, doesn't flow out. You've got a little strip Canaan here. It's smaller than our state of New Jersey. It's a little bitty. And if you go through Canaan, I'm going to go to the edge of it, but we'll just say this section is Canaan. And I'll try not to flash anybody in the eyes. And if you go back here, you can veer around and say you turn in that aisle where you go to leave. Back in here, in this back section, if you were to look back in that section, that's going to be Egypt, okay? Egypt winds around the Egyptians, and Israel had come up from there. So you have this here, you guys, Gaza right over in here, boo. Gaza's right at the edge of that. And then here you've got the Mediterranean Sea. So you got a little picture of where it is and what's happened. Let me show it to you on some maps. Already up there. So you saw what happened. These are two alternative routes that he could have taken. Either one, you've got Euphrates here and Tigris here. See Babylon up here. Here's your Persian Gulf down in here, here, Babylon, Assyria, up in Haran. And they come down into this Canaan. Right there would be your Sea of Galilee. And it dumps down, and right there would be by Hebron. Jerusalem, Bethlehem is your Dead Sea. Gaza somewhere, I think, right down here. Look at the next one. I think it shows, it's a little more, there it shows you more what that looks like. The Sea of Galilee, you picture an ocean. It's not an ocean. It looks a lot like, what's the lake I always say it looks like? Big Lake. Yeah, it could be Lake Texoma. Yeah, Lake Texoma might be better. I'm thinking of a little smaller one. But it's a lake. And you can look across to the other side. I mean, it's not a huge sea. It's a lake. And but it's called the Sea of Galilee. Galilee region, very fertile region. You got Jordan River. Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. And then your Dead Sea. Ben, this is you. Keep this in mind, okay? This is you. And you got right in here, you've got, I can't quite read that. I think that's Bethlehem and Jerusalem within 7 miles. Gaza's right here, and I think the West Bank is somewhere right in here. And so that is your so that you get a picture where this is all taking place. So we've got Abraham. He's come into the promised land, and he comes with the eyes of faith. These are just little cues. The eyes of faith are really two suns, so they're really eyes. The letter I. God says, I'm going to bless you, and there's going to be a nation. And he says, well, there's just one big problem with that. We've been together decades, and we can't have a child. I told you I'm going to bless you. Well, he starts getting a little antsy. And so when he's 86 years old, Sarah, his wife, comes in and says, Abraham, this isn't going to happen. So let's take Hagar, my slave, my Egyptian handmaid, my bondservant, and I will give her to you, and you can go into her, and as she has a child, we will take that child and make it our child of promise, because we have to help God, because he just can't do it. And it's an example of a good thing. It just doesn't happen when we think. A lot of times God will make us wait a long time. And so she gives him over, and then she despises Hagar because Hagar immediately gets pregnant. Hagar has Ishmael. Guess who Ishmael becomes? He becomes the Midianites in the Old Testament. The Midianites were grave enemies of the Israel. They eventually become the Arabs. Guess how that works? Doesn't work so good. Genesis 16, 11 and 12. I want you to hear this description for the Ishmaelites that was given and what they would be like. Genesis 16, 11 and 12 says this. The angel of the Lord said to her, to Hagar, you've conceived and you will have a son. You'll name him Ishmael. For the Lord has heard your cry of affliction, because Sarah grew jealous and threw her out. This man will be like, who's Ishmael going to be like? What's his people going to be like? Like a wild donkey. His hand is going to be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will settle near his relatives. Does that not describe the Arabs perfectly? That's not meant to be negative. He said, they're going to be a powerful, strong people, but they're going to be like a donkey, very obstinate, very strong-willed, very much independent, and they're going to be hostile. They're going to be prone to be hostile toward everyone around them, and everyone's going to be prone to be hostile to them. That was the problem with her doing that. The Arabs then became bitter enemies. Folks, our president, United States is, I think, it's very prideful of us to think we're going to fix that. We're not. And that's the reason you can get upset about it. There's the reason the Palestinians say, we don't want the land divided. We want Israel gone forever. We will take from the Jordan River, from the river to the sea. They want from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and they said, we won't be happy till we have every bit of it and Israel's gone. There's a bitter divide because at age 100, God did what he said he was going to do, and all of a sudden Sarah becomes pregnant. Abraham's now 14 years after he has Ishmael. She gives birth to Isaac. If the Arabs come from Ishmael, where does Isaac end up being? That's the Israelites. The Israelites going to come from Isaac. Someone was telling me this morning, they said, I have someone I have visited with several times, and I said, the Israels were promised the promise. And no. God gave the promised land to Ishmael. It's interesting because Ishmael ended up, his family had 12 princes who are going to have 12 tribes, and 12 heads of the tribe are going to be Israel. Satan always mocks and imitates. If you look at the tribulation period, he will mock everything God's trying to do in that time to set his kingdom up like God's, but not God's. So who does God pick between Ishmael and Isaac? It's the fight of the day. The Arabs all say Ishmael. Christians in the Bible make it very clearly he chose Isaac. Not that Ishmael did anything wrong. God said, I'll bless you. And the Arabs have become a powerful people who own a large portion of the world, and some of them are exceptionally wealthy. But that was God's promise. Genesis 25, God blessed Isaac. Let me read it to you. Genesis 25, 23 through 26. The Lord said, there are two nations in your womb. Two peoples will come from you and be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins within her womb. The first one came out red-looking, covered with hair, like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. After that, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel with his hand, so they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. So you have Abraham, then God chose who after Abraham? Isaac. And then after Isaac, you're having Esau and Jacob. And God said there are going to be two nations again that are going to come out from them. Guess who Esau is, so that you can remember him? Look on your paper. He's the hairy hunter. Esau is a hairy hunter. He came out covered like velvet. He was a hairy, very hairy man. And it's interesting because Esau means red, and his people, the city where he settled would be Edom, which means red. And it's going to be interesting because he's going to give up his birthright for red stew. Look in verse 30. He said to Jacob, let me eat some of that red stuff because I'm exhausted. That's why he was also named Edom. Another name for him, the Edomites. Here's the story. Esau was a hairy hunter. And he gave up his birthright because he came in one day famished. He'd been hunting and he had not killed anything. And he came in and Jacob had fixed some yummy looking stew. And he said, I'm dying, give me something to eat. And he said, give me your birthright. Why did he get the birthright? He was born first. Esau should have been, the firstborn should have got the birthright. They always did, which means they got 2/3 of the inheritance, and they were the chief and the priest of the family. They had special rights as the eldest born son. But Jacob came out, if you remember, it said holding his heel. Means they were already fighting over who was going to be first. Well, look who Jacob is compared to old hairy hunter. Jacob is mama's boy. While Esau hunts and is an outdoorsman and is his dad's favorite, Jacob was a plain man, gentle man. He was an indoor boy. He was mama's favorite. He liked cooking. So what did she do? She connived. He had already gotten the birthright, but then, at the end times, it would come a time where the father would call him the sons and he would speak a blessing that he would pass on to them from God. Very big thing. Well, she starts conniving. So you see all the way back at this point, you see with Isaac and Rebekah that they're a flawed family. They have favorites, and she wants that youngest son to get that blessing. So she says, I want you, your father at this point, he was just about dead. He couldn't see, he couldn't hardly hear. He was at the very end of life. And she said, I want you to go in and I want you to cook him some food and make it taste like wild game so that he thinks that it's Esau. But I want you to trick him so that he'll give you the firstborn's blessing. He goes, Mom, but he's a hairy man and he smells different than me. And so she killed a goat, put the goat on his arms, put goat hair on his neck. I mean, what's godly about this? What mom does that to her other son? And so he goes in to his dad and he goes in with Isaac and he says, I've brought you food from the field, Father. And the father goes, it smells like your brother, but it sounds like I'm talking to Jacob. He says, stick your arms and your hands out, son. And Genesis tells us that the dad felt his arms, top of his arms, and that. Smelled the clothing he was wearing. He'd put on his brother's clothing and said, okay. And so he gave him the blessing. It shows again that if they would have trusted God, was God going to give that to Jacob? He said he was. Did they need their help? What a sad thing. For years, Jacob ran from Esau because he was sure Esau would destroy him and he feared Esau. And finally, Esau caught up to him, and Esau at this point was exceptionally wealthy and very powerful, and he was the man's man. So Jacob, scared to death of him, he blessed his brother, said, I forgive you. God's given me all this. He's blessed me too. God's in charge. And so in Romans 9:10 through 14, it talks about this when God's talking about his sovereignty. And in Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 14, he's already talked a little bit, and he has talked about Israel's rejection of Christ, and he's talked about how God selects who he's going to select. And then he talks in chapters 10 through 14, he brings up Jacob and Esau, and he says these words in Romans in the New Testament. And not only that, but Rebekah conceived children through one man, our father Isaac. For though her sons had not been born yet or done anything, they had not done anything good or bad yet, so that God's purpose according to election might stand, not from the works, but from the one who calls. She was told, the older is going to serve the younger. As I've written, I've loved Jacob, but I hated Esau. You need to understand that strong wording, but it's not hate from an emotional. It doesn't mean that God hated Esau. He blessed Esau. It means from the standpoint that his preference, his choice, intellectually, his love was extended to Jacob first. He chose him above that. Not any kind of hatred or any kind of problem there. Because it says that neither had done any good when God made that choice. Verse 14, so what should we say then? Is there injustice with God? And then it says, absolutely not. And then he says, I've already told Moses, I'll show mercy whom I show mercy. I'll harden the Pharaoh's heart if I choose to do that. And then God says, what is a lump of clay to ask the potter what's right and wrong with what he does with him? And the goal of that is that's unsettling some of you right now. If I begin to talk about election or predestination, or that not one of us would be here if God didn't choose us first, some of y'all will start squirming. No, I have full authority over my life. No, you don't. God is God. And a 2-year-old child can argue with me for 6 hours straight saying, I know everything you know, and I know better, and I can see the big picture, and you are wrong, and you're going to laugh until you finally swat them. And God does the same thing when we say, who are you to do that? God said, wait, I don't think you get this. I created you. I can do anything I want. And you can feed your dog one night, or you can choose not to feed your dog one night. You can brush him every day or not brush him. You can let him live in air conditioning, or you can leave him out in the sun to die, because you own that dog, and I own all humanity and all heaven and earth. And so God is God. And so he says, I did that. The reason I did that with both Ishmael and Isaac, and then I showed it again with Jacob and Esau, is to say, I'm not a predictable God. I'll choose whom I choose. What it means to us is if you're sitting in this room and you've accepted Jesus, he chose you first. If you started longing for him, it's because he placed that in you. If you started being aware you were a sinner, it's because he started convicting you. The person out there who's never thought about God, they could care less about a God. They don't even believe in a God. They think they're perfect. They think they are God. All our politicians think they're God. And they're so dumb compared to the wisdom of God. It's just almost unbearable. And so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob was who God chose, and then God blessed Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. Who are those 12 sons? You ever heard of the 12 tribes of Israel? You go, who in the world are those 12 tribes? What's the big deal about them? They are the families that will go out and spread out, and they're to intermarry amongst the 12 different family groups of Israel. In that. So you've got Reuben, you've got Simeon, you've got Levi, you've got Judah. What's special about him? Judah's the one God chose, he didn't earn it. God chose him to be where the Messiah would come from. Jesus, the Lion of Judah, the tribe of Judah. You got Dan, you got Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and there's 2 last brothers. Who was the favored brother of Jacob? Joseph. Talk about daddy's boy. He was the 11th child, and who was the 12th child? Benjamin. And you can read that story there in that Genesis story of Joseph and Benjamin and their special tie. There's a daughter, Dinah. I'm not going to go in. Our time's getting short. Dinah created two of the brothers because of something done to her, slaughtered an entire family, and that was Levi and Simeon, and Jacob was not happy with that. Joseph is the one we're going to hone in on, the favored son. You have another picture of the very chosen, most elite of all the Old Testament. Chosen as one of the patriarchs of the nation, but not because he was perfect. He treated Joseph different than all his other sons. He'd send them out to work. He'd let Joseph stay home. And then he loved Joseph so much that he's going to give him special favors. Joseph is a picture. Have you ever heard that Old Testament, that's a type or it's a shadow or it's a picture of the New Testament? What that means is in the Old Testament, God gives you glimpses of what's coming in the New Testament, and he's given us glimpses today of what's going to happen in heaven. Joseph is the clearest type or shadow or picture of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. They were both especially beloved by their fathers. Both of them were shepherds. Both were severely tempted. Both were taken to Egypt. Both were sold for a price of a slave. Both were highly exalted after suffering immensely. And there's many more. But Joseph gives a picture of a man who is a picture of what Christ would be, and forgiveness and deliverance and all those things. Well, because Dad loves Joseph the best, he gives him a coat of many colors. Brothers resented that. Joseph was a braggart. He'd say, I had a dream y'all are all going to serve me someday. Fathom that. Well, should he have said that? No, don't tell them that. Hold it in your heart. He had the coat of many colors. They got so bitter, they took him out. They threw him in a pit. They would have killed him if it wouldn't have been for the oldest brother, Reuben, saying, no, let's don't kill him. Let's sell him into slavery. So they sold him to some Midianite traders. The Midianites were headed that way, to Egypt. And so they go down in Egypt, and guess where he falls? Someplace very soft. A Potiphar. Potiphar's palace. P-O-T-I-P-H-A-R. Potiphar. He fell in a pot of fur. And he rose up, even in the midst of that kind of suffering. God blessed everything he did. He rose up to be running. He was running Potiphar's house. Well, guess what happens? Potiphar has a wandering wife, a woman of folly that Proverbs talks about. She begins to fall in love with Potiphar and wants him. Begins to fall in love with Joseph and wants him. Joseph says, I could never do this to God or to your husband who has been so good to me. One day, in a moment, she grabs him, and he literally gets up and runs out, and she grabs what he's wearing, and it comes off of him as he's leaving, and she shows it to her husband and says, look what he tried to do to me today. So he is unrighteously thrown in a dungeon and forgotten for a long time. But it was in the dungeon that God's will came about, because in the dungeon, the Pharaoh of Egypt had a dream that really bothered him. None of the men in the whole land could interpret it. And there's this slave down in the dungeon who has a special relationship with his God. And so he calls him out, and guess who Joseph becomes? The prime minister of all Egypt. Number 2 in power under the Pharaoh only, because God has a plan. Remember, when you're suffering, it's always going to result in God preparing you for something he has for you down the road. Because back on the ranch, not in Egypt, but back home where his brothers and dad lived, there's a famine. And they had grown at this point to 70 whole people. That doesn't sound like a blessing of seed. In the Abraham, they're going to be big people. There's 70 of them. Well, Joseph brings his people over under the blessing of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh gives them some of the best land, Israel, in Egypt during this famine. God protects them and segregates them. They intermarry, and guess in Exodus, they were there 400 years, and in 400 years, in Exodus, which we'll start that book next week, When they leave Egypt, guess how many of them there are? They've gone from a family of 70 to probably 2.5 million people. Said there were 600,000 men over fighting age who could be warriors. That means they were over 20. They were 21 or above. They married young back then. So if you have 600,000 of those above the age, 21 and above, you probably, most of those have a wife, and then most of them have 2 kids. Most of those had way larger families back then. So at least 2.5 million people leave Egypt, or are going to leave Egypt. They're living in Egypt in this time, and guess what happens? The Pharaoh dies, Joseph dies, people who are familiar. The new pharaohs come up and they're evil, and they look and they begin to say, these slaves are more powerful than us. And if we don't oppress them fully, they could rise up and cause us problems. And so they take them in bondage, and that's where we're going to pick up in Exodus, which is the exit next week. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes, and the 2 things I want you to think about this morning. The first one, are you willing to go through pain to follow God? If you're truly going to be used by God, you're probably going to have to understand some suffering to get there, because we don't naturally conform to the image of Jesus without some fire and pain. The second question I would ask is, are you willing to wait on God's timing? Most of our problems aren't that we suffer, or they aren't that we don't see the dreams and blessings of God. It's that it's so long before we begin to see them. In my life, things haunted me. More things haunted me than I understood until I turned about 53 or 54. And all of a sudden I began to went bam, 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 bam. That's God is blessed and blessed and blessed and blessed. And I just couldn't see it because there were so many fires in the midst of that, and trials and tribulations and growing up I needed to do, and failures. And then I began to say, he's been so good. And that's exactly where some of you are. Gifted and blessed beyond what you can imagine, but you can't see it yet because you're still struggling. And in timing of things, I got to have it now. It should happen today. And God said, wait, just wait. I got a perfect time for you. Don't get in front of me. You'll mess something up. Take a moment. Let him speak to you. And then we'll close with real brief prayer, and we'll be through. Father, we're in awe of you. You work everything out. And when we see how much is in just the book of Genesis, it tells us, it gives us the whole foundation to everything in life. Help us to believe. Father, all of us can have faith when we just say we do. But it's through the fires and the trials and the postponed gratification and answers to prayer that you really test that faith to see if it's real or if we're just speaking without believing. So strengthen us to believe that you're always in control and you're good. We love you. We praise you. We thank you for today. In Jesus' name, amen.